Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's webinar on Where are U.S.-China relations headed after U.S. election? Before we begin, may I please remind everyone that you can submit your questions at any time for the Q&A function on your device. May I now invite the Chamber's Americas Committee Chairman, Mr. Steve Wong, to deliver the welcome remarks. Mr. Wong, please.
Thank you, Fiona. Good afternoon, Mr. Stephen Olsen, and to fellow members watching online. Thank you for joining this webinar to discuss how the change of administration in the White House will affect where U.S.-China relations are headed after the U.S. election. The 2020 presidential election resulted in the highest electoral turnout in the history. Although Joe Biden received the most votes in U.S. election history, President Donald Trump is questioning the integrity of postal ballots and is preparing legal challenges. The result also shows how divided the United States is. Voters supported Donald Trump's policy relating to the economy and American first, but they believe he did a bad job handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Biden's pledge to focus on the pandemic and restore American leadership in international organizations seemed to be what the majority of voters wanted. Biden spoke very little about China during his campaign, and he is not expected to change the US direction of containing China. So what might we expect to see change regarding the US engagement with China under a Biden presidency? And what will the election result mean for relations between Washington and Beijing? Further consideration of the relationship benefits neither US nor China businesses. So how can the US and China work together to resolve differences in the new global economic landscape? We do not have a crystal ball with us today, but we are very happy, very pleased to have something close. We have Mr. Stephen Olsen, Research Fellow at the Heinrich Foundation in Hong Kong, speaking to us from Bangkok. As many of you know, Stephen is extremely knowledgeable on US and China trade policies and is a respected commentator for many international media organizations. You can send him your questions at any time during this presentation via the Q&A box, via the chat box. So without further ado, may I pass the floor to Steve to give us his presentation. Over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve, very much, and a very warm good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the Heinrich Foundation, I'd like to thank the Chamber for their kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. Needless to say, our topic, where's the U.S.-China trade relationship headed after the elections, could hardly be more timely, and I'm looking forward to what I'm sure is going to be a very, very interesting conversation for us today. So if you'll bear with me, I have just a couple of slides and I will attempt to share my screen. All right. So in terms of my comments this morning, what I'm going to do is focus my attention primarily around 2 points. First of all, I want to look at several specific questions related to China that the Biden administration will have to address fairly early on. But then because the US-China trade relationship does not take place in a vacuum, I'd like to broaden our lens a little bit and look at the overall trajectory of US trade policy under the Biden administration and the role of the United States in the global trade system, and perhaps more to the point, how will the rest of the world be reacting to the United States? All right, so let us begin then by focusing specifically on some US-China issues. Now, prior to the election, the conventional wisdom was that Beijing probably would prefer a Biden victory. That was certainly the view of the US intelligence community. To be honest with you, though, I'm not sure that that's correct. Biden will do two things that Trump has not done. Number one, he will place a much higher priority on human rights issues. And I think it's inevitable that the human rights agenda will spill over onto the trade agenda and further complicate the trade agenda. The second thing that Biden will do, which Trump did not, Biden is a firm believer in the value and the benefit of working constructively through an alliance system. So I would expect very early on in his administration for Biden to reach out to the European Union, to Japan, to Australia, to Canada, to other like-minded countries to attempt to present Beijing with more of a unified front on a set of trade grievances. And so over the longer run, despite how combustible the Trump presidency was, Beijing might actually have found the go-it-alone approach of the Trump administration easier to contend with than the multilateral approach that Biden, I think, is very likely to take. In any case, however, upon assuming the presidency and before that, the administration is going to have to focus on three basic questions. What to do with regard to the punitive tariffs put in place by President Trump, what to do with the Phase 1 agreement, and how to move forward over the longer term in the China relationship. I would expect both the tariffs and the Phase 1 agreement to remain in place, at least initially. Given how tough the campaign rhetoric was about China on the campaign trail, I don't think that Biden has any political cover to ease off on the tariffs. And given the fact that China is behind in its purchase commitments under the Phase 1 agreement, he's got even less of a substantive reason to ease off on the tariffs. Now, having said that, I do not expect that he will terminate the Phase 1 agreement. That would unnecessarily antagonize Beijing with little immediate payoff. And also keep in mind that if China continues its strong recovery from the COVID economic slowdown, by the time Biden is sworn in as president, China will very likely be in a position to continue to ramp up their purchases of US goods, which of course provides even more reason to stick with the Phase 1 agreement. Now then, in terms of our third question, which is, well, what about the path forward over the longer term between these two countries? I think the key thing to keep in mind here is that Biden has largely the same trade agenda vis-a-vis China as Trump did. Industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, technology transfer, national security concerns over technology companies, et cetera. So much so that Trump has even gone so far as to accuse Biden of plagiarism when it comes to his China trade policy. Now, although a lot of these issues, these trade issues, have been on somewhat of a side burner since the COVID pandemic really started to take hold, these underlying frictions have not disappeared. Okay, they'll inevitably resurface, and so at some point, Chinese and U.S. negotiators will once again have to sit down across the negotiating table from each other. Now, look, whether Biden decides to stick with the nomenclature of the Trump administration and refer to that as Phase 2 negotiations, or he uses some different framework, really isn't terribly important because the fundamental agenda is going to be largely the same. Now, in terms of where this will lead and potential paths forward, one possible path forward, and I would argue perhaps even the most logical path forward for these two countries, would be to engineer a responsibly managed partial economic decoupling. I think now with the benefit of hindsight, which is of course always 2020, I think we can see that the very high levels of economic integration that these two countries have been pursuing for the past 2 to 3 decades was perhaps a bit unrealistic and maybe a little bit, maybe even a little bit naive given how fundamentally different the economic systems are, given how profound the differences are in governing philosophy, and given the rising geostrategic, the rising geostrategic tensions between these countries. Now, I want to be clear. I am not suggesting anything approaching a complete economic decoupling. I do not think it's possible, and I do not think it is in anybody's interests. So there would continue to be ample opportunity under a Biden administration going down this road for cooperation, for trade and investment to flourish. So I think, for example, everybody would be very pleased if American farmers were selling more soybeans in China. I don't think anybody would have any particular problem if Chinese consumers wanted to wash their hair with American shampoo. I think that would be fine. But should we have ever had any expectation that a company like Huawei would be permitted to build out the 5G infrastructure in the United States? Probably not. Now, I want to emphasize that this responsibly managed, and I think that's really the key phrase, it needs to be responsibly managed, partial economic decoupling does not need to be adversarial. It does not need to be combative. It does not need to be controversial. And in fact, I would say over the longer term, this is actually the path to a much more stable relationship and a much more mature relationship because it will be more firmly rooted in reality. All right, so let me now, because as I said, because none of this will be unfolding in a vacuum, it will all be unfolding in a much wider context. Let's turn our attention a little bit to some of the broader questions. The overall direction of US trade policy under Biden and the role of the United States in the global trading system. Now, the first question I would really draw your attention to and encourage you to keep a close eye on is how much impact will the progressive wing of the Democratic Party have on Biden's trade policy? We saw during the nominating process, the Democratic primaries, where they were selecting who would be their candidate for the president of the United States, we really saw the beginning of a bit of a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. This battle was taking place between the progressive wing, which is led by people like Senator Elizabeth Warren, AOC in the House of Representatives, and of course, Bernie Sanders. On the other side, we have the more traditional centrist wing of the Democratic Party, which is absolutely personified by Joe Biden, and which includes people like, of course, Nancy Pelosi. Now, the desire to beat Donald Trump was so intense that this battle was suspended. They decided to call a truce on this battle and line up behind Joe Biden because they thought Biden could do three simple things that nobody else could do. They thought he could win Wisconsin, they thought he could win Michigan, and they thought he could win Pennsylvania. And if he did so, he would reestablish the blue wall and tilt the electoral count over that magic number of 270 and put the Democrats back into the White House. The plan worked. At least it appears that the plan has worked as of now. Biden got over that 270. So now that that is settled, we've got to anticipate that this battle is going to recommence between the progressive wing and the more centrist wing of the party. It's very relevant for our discussion today because we need to understand that a lot of the policy positions articulated by this progressive wing are fairly extreme. So just to give you a point of reference, when she was running for president, Elizabeth Warren laid out a plan which stipulated a whole variety of conditions that any country would have to meet if they wanted to be in a free trade agreement with the United States: labor, environmental, social issues, etc. I'm not 100% sure how many countries there are that ever could have complied with all these, or even if any countries could comply with all of these. For instance, the United States could not have a trade agreement with any country that provided subsidies for fossil fuels, or the United States could not enter into free trade agreements unless the country protected religious freedoms. Well, how do you define religious freedoms, and who is the person making the judgment as to whether or not they exist in a particular country? Now, I'm not suggesting that Biden is going to adopt these policies wholesale. He will not, but this will give you a really good indication of the pressure that he's going to be under internally in his party, and the direction they're going to try to push his trade policy. So it is very important that we keep our eye on how this battle unfolds. And I want to offer one suggestion to you if you want to monitor how things seem to be going. I would suggest keep a close eye on some key appointments, okay? In particular, who gets appointed U.S. Trade Representative and who gets appointed Secretary of Commerce. There is a very old cliche in Washington, D.C., but one which I think has a lot of truth to it. Personnel is policy. So you look at the person put in place, and that will give you a real good indication of at least the direction from a policy point of view that agency and the U.S. government is going to be following. Now, irrespective, though, of how this internal battle plays out within the Democratic Party, I really want to stress that we've all got to wrap our brains around the fact that the United States has really, in a very fundamental way, crossed the Rubicon on international trade. There will not be any return under a Biden administration or any other administration in the foreseeable future. There will not be a return to the full throttle pursuit of free trade that we saw under Bill Clinton, that we saw under George Bush, or that we saw under Barack Obama. There is an increasing belief across the political spectrum in the United States that these free trade agreements that have been negotiated, that they worked out really, really well if you are a multinational corporation. They worked out really, really well if you were a large financial institution, but considerably less well if you were in the American middle class. And so I think it is evident at this point that US trade policy with regard to China or with regard to any other country in the world is going to be considerably more US worker-centric. And Biden himself has not been beating around the bush on this topic at all. He has said point blank that under his administration, there will be no return to quote unquote business as usual on trade. So keep your eye on how this battle plays out, this contest within the Democratic Party plays out, but keep in mind that to a large degree, the US has already crossed the Rubicon on international trade. Second question, I really want to draw your attention to and ask you to keep an eye on is related more to what role will the United States play in the global trading system under Biden. And this is related to a fundamental question. How will the rest of the world react to a post-Trump America? Now that the American people have decided to revert to a conventional president, after 4 years of the most tumultuous, combative, norm-busting, unconventional presidency in US history, do things just go back to the way they were before? Or have there been some fundamental, irreversible changes that have taken place? Or put more bluntly, look, was Trump just a temporary blip, or are we now in a completely different world? Now, from a trade perspective, I actually do not think that the US-China trade war was the most disruptive thing that Donald Trump did. I think the most disruptive move that Trump made on trade was to very deliberately and actively abdicate the traditional US leadership role in the global trading system. Now, as I'm sure all of you know, the United States was the primary architect of our modern global trade system in the aftermath of the Second World War. And in the 7 decades since that time, has been the primary force propelling that system forward. And this has been a role that has been embraced by US presidents literally from Harry S. Truman in 1948 through to Barack Obama in 2016. And the rationale for American leadership was basically that by pursuing deep economic integration through trade, we could create a world that was both more prosperous and more peaceful. Of course, Donald Trump comes along and he sees the world in fundamentally different terms. He finds the economic argument in favor of trade completely unpersuasive. And for him, these vague notions, these vague concepts about the value of American leadership, in his mind, all of that is just an excuse for foreign countries to get a free ride on American coattails. And so for the past 4 years, flowing from that worldview, we've seen the WTO bypassed, we've seen the WTO undermined, we've seen unilateral trade actions taken, we've seen free trade agreements renegotiated under the threat of termination, and we've seen ostensibly free trade, at least, replaced by negotiated purchase commitments, notably, of course, in the case of the phase 1 agreement with China. And so from the perspective of the rest of the world, it seemed like the United States was determined to break every norm and to really blow up the very trade system that the United States had been responsible for creating in the first place. So the question that we've really got to focus on now to understand not just US-China, but America's broad role in the trading system is, can the rest of the world trust the United States again? Can the rest of the world, will the rest of the world once again embrace American leadership? Well, of course, I cannot answer that question definitively for you today, but I would suggest that as things unfold, keep your eye on the interplay between two contradictory forces to see which direction we seem to be heading in. On the one hand, let's face facts. Donald Trump did not only exhaust America, Donald Trump exhausted the whole world, okay? And so there is this deep hunger now to return to greater normalcy, to return to greater stability, to return to greater predictability in the trade system. And for that reason alone, I think there'll be a certain receptivity to once again returning to American leadership. On the other hand, we've got to keep in mind that over the past 4 years, the rest of the world had no alternative other than to move on without the United States. Now, it would be an exaggeration to talk about a post-American world, but in a very real sense, the rest of the world adjusted to no longer having the United States at the head of the table, certainly in the international trade system and a number of other spheres as well. So the question now is, okay, well, now that you've squeezed the toothpaste out of the tube, is it possible to put the toothpaste back in the tube? And maybe more to the point, should you even bother trying? Okay. Now, one last point as you watch this move forward, as you reflect on this, as you imagine how the rest of the world is going to react to a post-Trump America. One other point to really to reflect on and to keep your eye on. Going into the election, the Democratic Party was really hoping for a blue wave. They were hoping for a landslide election that would really firmly mark a rejection, a repudiation of Donald Trump and Trumpism. It did not happen. Yes, from based on where things stand today, it appears that Biden has won the election, but by a razor-thin margin in several key states, and Donald Trump won an incredible 71 million votes. This is the second most votes in American history, second only to Biden, who had 76 million. So the election does not present a definitive close to Trump and Trumpism. It does not represent a repudiation. And so if you're a political leader, if you're a trade policy maker in world capitals around the world, in Brussels, in Tokyo, in Beijing, in Seoul, anywhere throughout the world, you're looking at the American election and you're saying, well, I guess, you know, in terms of predictability and the stability of the system, it's positive that Biden appears to have been elected. But what are the Americans going to do in 2024? They went for Trump and Trumpism once. He amassed 71 million votes in 2020. Where might the American people go in 2024? And there are already a number of Republicans trying to position themselves to kind of take the mantle over from Trump. And on top of that, I know this might be a little bit of a cold water in the face, but Donald Trump himself has said that if Biden, quote unquote, steals the election, that Trump himself has not ruled out the possibility of running again in 2024, which he would absolutely be allowed to do. So we've got other people trying to position themselves. We've got the possibility of Donald Trump coming back. And believe it or not, there's even talk potentially about Ivanka Trump. Now, I don't think that's particularly plausible, but if you asked me in 2015, I would have told you that Donald Trump was completely implausible. So in terms of the role of America in the global trading system, and in terms of the way the rest of the world will now react to this post-Trump America, I think we need to bear that closely in mind. I will draw my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to any comments or questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry for forgetting to unmute my mic. Okay, thank you very much for Stephen, for your insightful sharing. I think your sharing is really insightful to us. I think we're coming into the Q&A section. I think for all our audience, if you have any question, please feel free to post on the chat room. Then I will select the question in the order that I will forward your question to Stephen for answer. And then first of all, maybe allow me to ask a few questions. One question to start with. I want to ask one economic question in connection with the economy of Hong Kong. Actually, on 30th October, Hong Kong government formally launched the procedures in accordance with the World Trade Organization (WTO) dispute settlement mechanism with respect to the new requirement on the original marking for Hong Kong products announced by the USDA Customs and Border Protection on August 11. Is there a chance that we'll see the mark "Made in Hong Kong" label on exported goods to the US again?
Thanks, Steve. It's a very interesting question. Here's what I would say. The first thing to keep in mind is that when Biden assumes office, trade is not going to be anywhere near the top of his agenda. Job number 1 through 5 is going to be COVID, 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 COVID. And then beyond that, before he devotes too much attention to the trade agenda, and certainly before he considers any trade agreements, he's made it clear that he wants to focus on domestic issues, and in particular, domestic investments in things like education and infrastructure to make US workers more competitive. So there's not going to be, an initial turning to trade issues. I think over the longer term, it is certainly possible that that decision could be reconsidered and overturned, but I would again caution you that we're coming off an election campaign where, to the extent China came up, it was all about each candidate trying to position themselves as the tough guy on China, And so it then becomes very difficult early on in the administration to make any moves that looks, quote unquote, soft on China. It would seem to validate all of Trump's criticisms of him for being, quote unquote, soft on China. So over the longer term, I think it's entirely possible, but for a variety of reasons, I would not expect this issue to be high on the agenda early on in the Biden administration.
On behalf of the Hong Kong industries owners, I'm very sad to hear about this answer. Honestly. Okay,
well, there's every possibility I will be wrong. So.
Okay, let's go to the other question. From our member. If the U.S. does step back from a global leadership role in trade, who will take this place?
Again, a very, very topical and very, very important question. I think the short answer is that at least for now, I don't see any single country that is interested in or capable of sort of supplanting the traditional U.S. role. What I think is more likely, and what we've already seen starting coming together, is sort of a coalition of countries. Here I'm talking about the European Union, Japan, Australia, other like-minded countries trying to act, if not as the leader, as maybe the steering committee for the global trade system. At least in the interim, I think that's probably going to be the most likely scenario.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a question from Dominic Pan. Do you believe it possible for Trump to refuse to step down? If so, what would that scenario, look like?
Well, it's funny you asked, because before we started the session, Steve and I were chatting, and Steve posed sort of a similar question to me, and I mentioned I've lived for several years in the Middle East, and there is an old Arabic expression which I think addresses the situation that you're describing perfectly. And the Arabic expression is, the dogs in the town continue to bark, but the caravan moves on. So I think, Donald Trump can do what he wants. He can make, all of these, kind of off the wall accusations, but in the absence of concrete evidence that a court of law could actually take action on, there's very little he could do. And I would encourage you, as you watch things unfold, always keep a distinction in your mind between what is symbolically important and what is constitutionally important. Now, as Americans, it's symbolically important for us to have this smooth and this dignified transfer, right? That the loser of the election concedes defeat, graciously congratulates his opponent. If it's a sitting president who's been defeated, before the inauguration, he invites the incoming president. They sit, they drink a cup of tea to show that they're unified, and then they actually ride together to the inauguration. The ousted president is, there to show his solidarity. This is all very, very important, from a symbolic point of view. As an American, when I lived in Washington, D.C., whether the candidate I voted for won or lost the election, I would go to the inauguration. And it was always freezing weather. It was January, but I would stand out there because I thought it was important to say, even though I didn't vote for this guy, he's the president, and I've got to show my respect for the office. So all of those symbolic things that America really treasures probably are not going to happen under Trump, but it's the mechanisms of power, that really count, that really matter here. And on that front, unless, and I would triple underline the word unless he can make a compelling court case that a court is willing to say, time out, we've got some real issues here. Unless he can make that case, the caravan will roll on, and Joe Biden on January 20th, 2021 will be sworn in as president.
I see. Thank you. You have spoken quite confidently about that in the Biden administration. However, at this point, there are indications that the Trump team may be seeking to have Republican state Congress appoint Republican electors, not following their state laws. Do you see such a legal cop as a credible possibility?
What you're raising, in fact, thanks for the question, and it's certainly a good one. What you're raising is really sort of the nightmare scenario. The way the situation unfolds, again, constitutionally in the United States, is that on December the 8th, all of the states will certify their votes. Then, so that's, any counting, any recounting, whatever, all wrapped up by December 8th, they certify. Joe Biden won this state or Donald Trump won this state. Then 6 days later, the electors actually cast their votes. And it is on that date, mid-December, that the president is actually elected. In the age of television, we've become accustomed to thinking that we sit on our couch, we watch TV, and when CNN says this guy won the election, that's the election. CNN has no constitutional role. Okay, CNN doesn't have any function. It is really this mid-December casting of the electoral votes. Now, could or would any of those electoral votes for electors, they're referred to as electors, that come from a Biden state, then show up and cast their votes on Trump? And what would happen if they did? It would be a constitutional crisis. We would be in uncharted territory, and I couldn't even begin to speculate what would happen. But that would certainly be the nightmare scenario. The only thing I can say is we've had some highly contested elections previously. Certainly the 2000 election comes to mind, and it hasn't happened. And I think we're all keeping our fingers crossed it doesn't happen this year.
Okay, I think so too. Yeah. Regarding what you're earlier saying, I think Biden, after his presidency taking up, he will focus more on the pandemic. I'm sure I agree with you. But in fact, the economy of U.S. is under a very huge deficit.
Yeah.
How do you think Biden will take on about the economic situation? How can he relieve the current deficit situation?
Well, I think it's interesting because it does relate directly to our discussion on international trade, because certainly, the cornerstone of a number of President-elect Biden's policies do place an emphasis on encouraging American manufacturing, providing funding to encourage companies to reshore supply chains. Significant investment. I think his plan calls for $300 billion of investment in R&D in cutting edge sectors like AI and robotics. So this is going to be very interesting from a trade point of view, because his economic policies could potentially raise some trade issues and bring some things into question with regard to WTO compliance. His Buy American provisions, how will he square them with WTO government procurement requirements? That remains to be seen. And if he is going to be providing these subsidies for domestic manufacturing, where would they fall in terms of which subsidies are WTO legal and WTO illegal? Now, the United States will not be alone in that boat, because in the aftermath of COVID, so many countries have turned to subsidies to generate economic growth. And I think we're really going to have to sort out from a trade perspective which of these are compliant with WTO regulations and which of these subsidies are not. So I think it's going to raise some interesting challenges and some interesting debates from a trade policy point of view as well.
Okay. To what extent do you think, would Biden's trade and or foreign policy be affected if the Republican Party still retains the majority of the Senate majority?
Certainly,
Confined.
Yeah. It's a two-sided coin. Certainly, the fact that the Senate appears likely, or at least strongly possibly, to be heading to maintain Republican control, that will certainly constrain Biden in terms of his legislative agenda.
Right.
But I would encourage you to keep in mind the distinction between his legislative agenda, things that has to be approved both by the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, and his foreign policy. Under the U.S. Constitution, the American president has a lot more latitude to act, a lot more executive authority to act, to initiate his own foreign policy without having to run back to the Congress or to the Senate for approval. Now, of course, a large free trade agreement would be subject to approval, and so would have to run through those traps. But a lot of areas, broadly speaking, in terms of foreign policy, the fact that there appears there will be a Republican majority might not act as that much of a constraint on his ability to conduct the foreign policy he wants.
There's another question, from our member. I'm a founder of an abroad agency in mainland China, helping STEM.
I'm sorry. What kind of agency?
Education. Education. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think helping STEM students to pursue graduates or PhD degrees in the United States. Okay. In recent years, due to the deterioration of China-U.S. relationship, students are worried about the negative aspect of their visa and career path in the U.S. Do you think that the situation will get better under Biden's administration? Because I heard that so many Chinese students, they could not go to U.S. having no visa because they are not allowed to get visa.
Yeah, thanks for the question. This is, of all Trump's policies, this has been one that has really disturbed a lot of people and really struck a lot of people as being just a real lose-lose decision, and one that really hurts the best interests of the United States over the longer term. I can only offer you some speculation here, but personally, I have a strong gut level feel that we will see some loosening up here. I think this is an area where Biden would be philosophically inclined to take some steps and to make some adjustments. Now, does that mean that he would roll back 100% of the...
Sorry, Stephen, your microphone is muted. Yeah, it's okay.
So does that mean that Biden would roll back 100% of the restrictions that Trump put in place? Maybe not, but this is one area where I would have a fair bit of optimism that we might see a little bit of progress, because as I said, this strikes a lot of people as a real lose-lose move by President Trump.
Okay, thank you. This is a question from our Vice Chairman of Americas Committee, Mark Michelson, regarding the TPP. While it appears that the Biden administration would be unlikely to consider joining in the next couple of years, do you think that smaller, more focused agreement with CPTPP partners are possible on climate change or cybersecurity, for example?
Well, thanks, Mark, very much for that question. Here's what I would say about TPP. I would not close the door, actually, to the United States returning to the TPP with two caveats. It wouldn't happen early on in a Biden administration, and there would need to be some changes made. You know, it's a little bit ironic. Biden was vice president during the Obama administration that negotiated the TPP. And of course, during those days, Biden would have been a very strong advocate for it. Now, because the political ground on trade has shifted quite a bit in the United States, Biden's basic position is, well, I'm certainly willing to take a look at it, but we probably need some changes made. He hasn't specified in tremendous detail what those changes would be, but I would pretty confidently expect that they'd be around sort of beefing up some protections for US workers. Now, this raises then the real question, well, what is the appetite of the other 11 members to kind of revisit changes to bring the United States in? Keep in mind, these were tough negotiations. They were concluded with the US in the agreement. Then the United States pulled out of the agreement. It looked like the thing was going to fall apart. There was some initial disarray. Then Japan exercised a strong leadership role, pulled the thing together. They found a way to freeze some provisions, add some additional provisions, come up with the CPTPP. Now that they've got that up and running, is there really the desire or the interest now to potentially have to open the darn thing up again? I think there will be some appetite. You know, I think the United States, I think it would be so important to bring the United States in. I think there would be some limited appetite to entertain some changes to accommodate Biden's concerns, but I think there will be limits. So I think the question is, can the other members accept the magnitude of the changes that Biden would need? And I think that's going to be the important dynamic to see play out. In terms, though, irrespective of where we go with TPP, though, I think, Mark, the second part of your question, I think you're probably right. I think given a variety of factors, given how difficult it is to negotiate these agreements, given how tenuous the political environment might be in the United States, I think it's more likely that we will see more of these smaller deals, these quote unquote mini deals, these sectoral deals. I think at least for the short term, that might be the way, that might be the way forward, because it gets us around some of the complexities of congressional ratification. And when you negotiate these full-blown trade agreements, they're now becoming freighted down with so many additional provisions on these so-called, progressive issues, not just on labor, not just in environment, but rights of indigenous people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, although all of these issues are entirely valid, at a certain point we have to ask ourselves, at what point are we making it too complicated to successfully negotiate trade agreements by including these things? So this smaller, sectoral approach that was alluded to, I think very well might be the path forward.
Thank you again. Okay, this is a question from Roger Steele. During the discussion on which a country might take up a leadership of global trade, you mentioned earlier, Australia. Australia seems to now be embroiled in a real-life trade war with China, with various goods being, embargoed and quite shrill rhetoric from Beijing. What does this tell us about Beijing's approach, and how do you see this being resolved? Will Biden's somewhat, more multilateral approach help to diffuse this trade standoff, or possibly make it worse? Could the U.S. or others find themselves on the receiving end of the same treatment? Is an interesting question, but very important.
It is. I don't see, at least at first glance, any particular, determinative role that the Biden administration could play in this. I think it is an Australia-China issue. And to me, this is, look, if we've got any hope for the WTO, I think this is an area where we would hope to see the WTO being able to play a more constructive role. Of course, if we go the dispute settlement route, we know that the appellate body has been paralyzed as a result of U.S. blocking judges But again, that's an area where we might see some more constructive engagement from the Biden administration. The Trump administration just seemed determined to say no. No, no, no. Just seemed determined to block things, say no, block things, say no. I think the Biden administration will, again, have some similar concerns, but might be more willing to engage constructively and say, okay, you know what our concerns are. Let's try to find an accommodation here that we all can live with so that we can get this appellate body and this dispute settlement function back up and running. Let us hope, at least.
I think regarding this question, I think the background of the trade war between Australia and China was coming from, the request from US on countries to take side, previously. I think once Biden take on this position, I think this kind of request on taking side will be withdrawn, and then I think this situation will be improved certainly, I think.
I think certainly on the technology issues, though, I think we are facing a situation where the U.S. will probably continue to be in a position to exert at least some of that pressure. But again, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, right. Another question from Matthew Tam. Thank you so much for your sharing, Stephen. First of all, as you have mentioned to us that China would face even tougher, challenges from U.S. Biden administration than Trump's era. While do you think in some other aspect would the China and U.S. bilateral cooperation be improved? The cooperation be improved?
Yeah. Here's what I would say. As I mentioned, from a substantive point of view, the Biden trade agenda will look very similar to Trump's administration. But I think the entire environment will be improved and will be more constructive because the style, the tone, the tenor of trade policy is going to be a lot more conventional, a lot more responsible. I think we'll see a greater inclination to work through multilateral channels, to avoid some of these, to be less likely to take some of these unilateral actions. And I think that more constructive approach really can improve the environment, even if some of the underlying policy positions haven't changed that much. We're not going to be seeing, let's face it, in many instances, Donald Trump was making trade policy through Twitter. That's just not a constructive way to resolve any issues. And so to the extent we'll see a much more conventional trade policy being conducted by Biden, I think that at least bodes well and makes things a bit more likely for constructive resolution.
Okay, thank you. Another question from our member, David Ferguson. What do you think of the likelihood of the success of the class action litigation over section 301 List 3 and 4A?
I'm sorry, the class action suit on?
I repeat again, the class action litigation over section 301, List 3 and 4A.
It's hard to speculate. Certainly 301 had been a very, for instance, when I started my career as a trade negotiator in Washington, D.C., 301 was one of the primary tools that we had in our toolbox, and there wasn't any particular problem with it. Then when we got the WTO and we got a WTO dispute settlement mechanism, although 301 was never taken off the books in the United States, it really fell out of favor. We felt there wasn't any real reason to use it because we felt that the WTO dispute settlement mechanism could play that role. Then, of course, the Trump administration sort of rediscovered 301 and it's back in the limelight. I wouldn't be surprised as a practical matter in terms of how this is resolved. I wouldn't be surprised if during the course of the Biden administration, the use of 301 really starts to ramp down and at least some of the previous actions taken under 301 are removed. So I think it might, without making a comment on which way the class action suit might go, I think there's a strong likelihood that under the Biden administration, the 301 just becomes a lot less relevant and sort of gradually fades into the background.
Okay. In view of the time, I think we still have time for only 2 questions. The second one, the second ask is that from Charlie Wang. What is the risk that multilateral efforts to address trade tension with China result in slow or no progress? While allies may agree with the US on some grievance, they may not be able to agree on solutions.
So where are we going in terms of resolving US-China in the context of the multilateral setting?
Right. I think that's a question. Yes.
Okay. It's a really important point, and I will give you just a personal view on this, which you can feel free to agree with or disagree. The issues between the United States and China, I think, have to be worked out first by the United States and China, and then whatever accommodations the US and China are able to arrive at, then the WTO can absorb and adopt those resolutions at a pace and to an extent that it is comfortable doing so. But I have no confidence whatsoever that the WTO, a body consisting of 164 economies with wildly divergent views, will ever be able to develop consensus on their own to address some of these problems. So and this is a common reality in international trade, that 2 countries in the context of a free trade agreement or whatever the case might be break new ground, and then the WTO subsequently adopts those provisions. But I again, just a personal view, but I would not look to the multilateral trade system first and foremost to resolve the core issues between the US and China.
I see. As time is limited, may I allow me to ask the last question?
Sure.
After hearing your good sharing and also so many questions around, as being a businessman in Hong Kong, I'm looking forward on behalf of our chamber for some good news to Hong Kong businessmen. Can you summarize what are the good news that we can expect to see in the coming 4 years' time from Biden's administration?
Well, let's take an optimistic view. I think a couple of things I would say. The first thing that will happen that will really put us back on a more firm footing, and I think create some additional business confidence and some additional investor confidence, is that we're going to get back on a more stable, predictable, conventional way of conducting our trade relations. No tariffs being slapped on as a result of a tweet that was sent at 4 o'clock in the morning. I think much more due deliberation. I think much less unilateral actions taken by the United States. And I think one thing that is easy to lose sight of is that there was so much turmoil in the way that President Trump conducted his trade policy, that he broke so many norms and so many conventions in the international trade system. I think many businesses and investors will just feel comforted by the fact that even though all the problems are not magically going to disappear overnight, we're back into an environment of greater predictability and stability. And I think and hope that will be good for both business and investors.
Yeah, I hope so too. Okay. Thank you, Stephen, for your sharing with us your insights on the relationship between Beijing and Washington after the US presidential election. I'm sure our members have benefited from your presentation and have gained a deeper understanding of the US policy directions and the opportunities and challenges that we lie ahead of us. On behalf of our chamber, I would like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And to our members, thank you for joining this webinar. I hope that we will be able to meet you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everybody very much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.